I was standing in a church holding a funeral program when I looked across the room and understood, in a single, silent second, that everything I believed about my life was a lie. And the worst part? Everyone in that room already knew. Everyone except me. My name is Claire Hartley. I was 38 years old the day my entire world collapsed. Not with a fight, not with a dramatic confrontation, not with someone finally telling me the truth. It collapsed with a look. One look from a woman I had never met, across a grief-filled room, that undid 11 years of marriage in under 2 seconds. Before I tell you what happened at that church, and I will tell you everything, I promise, I need you to do one thing. If you've ever loved someone so completely that you made yourself blind, stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what I'm about to share with you is going to change the way you see trust, patience, and what it really means to take your power back. And if you're new here, welcome. My name is Claire, and I tell the stories that most people are too afraid to say out loud. Hit that subscribe button right now, because you do not want to miss what's coming. And drop a comment below. Have you ever had a gut feeling you ignored for too long? Tell me, I read every single one. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. I need you to understand what kind of woman I was before all of this. Not because I want your sympathy, I don't. I want your understanding. Because the version of Claire that walked into this story and the version that walked out of it are two completely different people, and the distance between them is the whole point. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. Middle child of 3 girls, raised by 2 working parents who were solid and steady and not particularly romantic, but deeply committed. My dad fixed things around the house on weekends. My mom kept a calendar on the refrigerator with everyone's activities color-coded. We weren't a family that talked about feelings very much, but we were a family that showed up. Always. That was the template I carried into my adult life, showing up. Being steady. Being the person people could count on. I was 26 when I met Daniel Hartley. I was at a birthday dinner for a mutual friend named Gwen, a low-key thing at an Italian place in Charlotte, maybe 15 people around a long table with candles melting down into wine bottles. Daniel was seated 3 chairs down from me, on the opposite side. He was 29, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with a kind of relaxed confidence that didn't need to announce itself. He was a structural engineer at a mid-size firm, and he talked about his work the way people do when they're actually interested in it. Not to impress, just because it genuinely occupied his mind. We started talking during the appetizers. We were still talking when the restaurant started turning chairs upside down on empty tables to signal that they wanted us gone. We walked out into the cold November air and stood on the sidewalk for another 30 minutes, hands buried in our pockets, breath visible, neither of us willing to end it. I drove home alone that night and sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for a few minutes before going inside. And I thought, with the kind of quiet certainty I almost never felt about anything, that's the man I'm going to marry. I've always trusted my gut. My gut has always been right. Except about him. We dated for 2 years. It was the good kind of dating, real and imperfect, and full of the small, ordinary things that actually matter. Weekend trips. Arguments about directions. Cooking dinner together and getting the proportions wrong. I learned that he was deeply attached to his mother, Patricia. I learned that he couldn't watch sad movies without getting stoic in the way men do, when they're actually moved but won't say so. I learned that he kept a worn paperback copy of The Old Man and The Sea on his nightstand that he'd read 4 times. I learned his coffee order and his sleeping schedule and the way he got quiet when something was bothering him but couldn't articulate what. I thought I knew him completely. He proposed on a Tuesday in October. An unremarkable Tuesday. I was in my bathrobe, half awake, standing in our kitchen reaching for coffee, when he got down on one knee right there on the tile floor between the refrigerator and the kitchen island. The ring was simple and perfect. I laughed so hard I almost dropped my mug. Then I cried. Then I said yes before he even finished the sentence, and he laughed too, and Biscuit, we'd adopted a golden mix the previous year, came in from the living room to investigate the commotion, and ended up in the middle of both of us on the kitchen floor. We got married the following June. 70 guests, outdoor ceremony at a venue outside of Charlotte, with string lights and a bluegrass band, and a cake that was slightly too sweet, but that everyone pretended was perfect. I remember standing at the altar looking at Daniel and feeling the specific, particular happiness of someone who believes they have exactly the life they were meant to have. I held onto that feeling for a long time, longer than I should have, longer than the evidence warranted. The first 5 years were genuinely good. I want to say that clearly, because I've talked about this story enough to know that people sometimes want a cleaner narrative. They want to hear that there were signs from the very beginning, that he was always cruel, that I should have known. But it wasn't like that. The first 5 years were real. We bought a house in Concord, a 4-bedroom craftsman with a backyard big enough for Biscuit. We built routines. We had friends over for dinner and took week-long vacations and spent Sunday mornings at the farmer's market. We argued about money and gutters and whose turn it was to deal with the pest control guy and what to watch on Friday nights. And those arguments felt like the texture of a shared life, not warning signs of anything. Daniel worked hard. His firm was growing, they were getting larger commercial contracts, and he put in long hours, often coming home after I'd already eaten dinner. I had my own career in healthcare administration, managing operations for a regional medical group, and I was building toward a director-level role that consumed a lot of my mental energy. We were both busy, both tired, both, I thought, content. His mother, Patricia, was woven into our lives from the beginning. She was a tall, immaculate woman, always in structured clothing, silver hair in a perfect chignon, posture like she'd been trained for it. She'd been widowed when Daniel was in his mid-20s, had managed the grief by filling her calendar with community board memberships and church committees and charity lunches, and had emerged from widowhood as a kind of controlled, purposeful woman who seemed to operate on precision and expectation. She was never warm to me. Not at our engagement dinner, not at the wedding, not at the holidays we hosted every other year where she sat at the head of the table in a house that wasn't hers. She was always perfectly civil. She always said the right things. But her smiles never reached her eyes, and I always had this vague sensation, the way you can feel a draft without being able to locate the window, that she had imagined a different life for Daniel and I was simply not what she'd had in mind. I told Daniel about it once early on. He dismissed it so gently and completely that I began to second-guess my own perception. "That's just how she is," he said. "She's warm in her own way, she loves you." He said it with such confidence that I decided I was misreading her. I chose to trust his read of his own mother over my own instincts. That was the first mistake, not the last. The shift didn't announce itself. That's what I want you to understand. There was no moment where I looked up and thought, something is wrong. It was more like the way a photograph fades, so gradually that you don't notice it day to day, and then one afternoon you pick it up and realize all the color is gone. It started around year 6. Maybe earlier, maybe I'm being generous with myself about the timeline. The trips became more frequent. 2, 3 nights away for work, where before it had been day trips or single overnights. Client dinners that went until 11, midnight, sometimes later. A growing list of names I didn't recognize. Colleagues, clients, contacts, that populated his conversations in ways I couldn't quite follow. He got a new phone and explained it casually as a work upgrade. He started going to the gym in the early mornings instead of evenings, which changed the rhythm of our whole day. None of it was dramatic. All of it was explainable. And I, steady, reliable, show-up Claire, accepted every explanation. I asked some questions. He answered them. I moved on. Because that's what trusting people do. Right? Here is the thing I now know about the way betrayal works. It doesn't rely on your blindness as much as it relies on your belief in the person. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't naive in the way people sometimes mean that word, passive and unthinking. I was simply operating inside a model of reality that Daniel had built very carefully, and the model was internally consistent. There were no glaring contradictions. The explanations always held. He was always home eventually. He always texted when he said he would. He was present at the things that mattered. Birthdays, anniversaries, the dinner parties where appearances had to be maintained. It's harder to see a lie when it's woven in among truths. That's the architecture of a sustained deception, not constant dishonesty, but strategic dishonesty. Small, selected lies placed precisely where they need to be to keep the whole structure standing. I had a feeling, though. I need to be honest about that. I had a feeling starting somewhere around year 7, and it lived in my chest like a small, cold stone. I couldn't point to any single thing. I couldn't say, here, this is the evidence, this is the thing that's wrong. It was more animal than that. A heaviness when he traveled. A heightened attention when he was on his phone. A sense, sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary evening, that I was sitting across from a man I couldn't quite see clearly anymore, like trying to look at something through slightly frosted glass. I didn't act on it. And I want to be very honest about why. I was afraid of being right. Being wrong about a gut feeling is embarrassing. Being right about a gut feeling like that one is devastating. And I loved Daniel. Or I loved what I believed Daniel to be. And I was not ready to find out the difference. So I stayed inside the comfortable version of reality for longer than I should have. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself successful, busy men in growing careers simply had less bandwidth for intimacy. I told myself that the emotional distance I felt was something we could work on, something we could fix with a weekend away, or a good conversation, or simply more patience on my part. I was kinder to him with my patience than I should have been. I want to pause here for just a second, because I know some of you are nodding right now. I know some of you are sitting there recognizing something in what I just described. That cold stone in your chest, that careful not looking. If that's you, I need you to hear what I say next very carefully. Don't go anywhere. Because what happens in the next part of this story is exactly why you can't afford to keep not looking. Comment below right now, I'm staying. I want to know you're with me. It was a Saturday in late February. Unremarkable weather, overcast, the kind of pale gray Carolina winter that's not cold enough to be dramatic, but strips all the warmth out of the afternoon light. Daniel had gone out to run errands. I was home doing something I'd been putting off for months, cleaning out the home office. We'd let it become a dumping ground for old files, instruction manuals for appliances we no longer owned, mail we'd meant to sort and never did. It was the kind of project you keep moving to the back of your mental list until you finally run out of excuses. I was working through a row of file boxes in the closet, pulling them out one by one and sorting their contents, when a paper fell from between two manila folders and drifted to the floor. I picked it up. It was a hotel receipt. Printed, not emailed. The Grand Hyatt in Nashville, Tennessee. 2 nights. Room for 1. January 14th and 15th. The bill was under Daniel Hartley's name, and the credit card charge matched one of his accounts. I stood in the closet holding that piece of paper, and my brain did something strange. It went very, very quiet. Not panicked. Just still. Like some part of me had been waiting for exactly this, for a long time, and now that it was here, there was almost a terrible calm to it. January 14th. I knew that date. I knew exactly where Daniel had told me he was on January 14th. That was the weekend of a professional conference he described in some detail. The location, the keynote speakers, the hotel where they'd put everyone up. He told me it was in Atlanta. He'd texted me from Atlanta. He'd called me from Atlanta, both nights, and told me about the restaurant they'd gone to and complained about the air conditioning in the conference room and asked how Biscuit was doing. Atlanta. He had been in Nashville. I sat down on the office floor. I don't remember deciding to. My legs just stopped holding me up. Biscuit wandered in from somewhere and put his head in my lap, the way he always did when something in the house's emotional atmosphere had shifted. And I sat there on the floor with his warm weight against me, and I looked at that receipt, and something inside me that had been cold and uncertain for 2 years made a decision. A quiet, unshakable decision. I was going to find out everything. I put the receipt back exactly where I'd found it, between the same 2 folders at the same angle. I finished the filing project. I made dinner. When Daniel came home, I was in the kitchen, and I said hello, and I asked about his errands, and I listened to his answers, and I watched his face with completely new eyes. That was the last day of the version of my life where I was unknowing. I want to tell you what it feels like to know the truth about your spouse and still come home to them every night. It feels like acting in a play that you've stepped outside of. You're still saying the lines. You're still moving through the scenes. But some part of you is standing in the wings, watching, separate, untouchable. I started methodically. Within the first week, I had gone through every financial document I could access. Daniel and I had joint accounts for household expenses, but he also had a separate personal account he'd maintained since before we married. He'd always described it as just a habit, a leftover from bachelorhood, nothing meaningful. I had access to paper statements because they occasionally came in the mail. I sat down with 18 months of them, a highlighter and a notepad, and I started building a picture. What I found made me feel as if the floor had gently, silently dissolved. Restaurants I'd never been to, charged on nights I thought he was at work dinners, I'd been told about in vague terms. Hotels in Nashville, Asheville, Atlanta, the real Atlanta this time, and once, inexplicably, New Orleans. A jewelry store charge from 2 Christmases ago, $437. I had never received jewelry from that store. A charge at a florist on a date that was not our anniversary, not my birthday, not Valentine's Day. Small recurring charges at a coffee shop in No-Da, a neighborhood of Charlotte I had no reason to frequent. I added up what I could identify. 18 months. Hundreds of dollars, then thousands, across dozens of entries. The architecture of a separate life, purchased on a card I hadn't thought to look at because I'd trusted him not to give me a reason to. I made a phone call I never expected to make. I called a private investigator. I found his name through a careful, cleared browser search on my phone on my lunch break at work. His name was Robert Vance. He was a former detective, quiet and professional, and he charged $400 a day. He told me to give him 2 weeks. I gave him 2 weeks and went home and cooked dinner and slept beside Daniel every night of those 2 weeks and did not say a word. Robert sent me a file on a Thursday evening. I opened it in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store because I didn't want to be inside the house when I read it. I needed to be able to fall apart somewhere I could control. Her name was Melissa Cho. She was 31 years old. She worked at Daniel's firm, not on his direct team, but in the same building, the same professional world. They had been seeing each other for at least 2 years, possibly closer to 3. She had a key to a 1-bedroom apartment in No-Da. That explained the coffee shop charges. That Daniel had been quietly subsidizing through a payment arrangement, Robert had traced back to a shell billing account, connected to a personal LLC Daniel had registered 2 years prior. A shell LLC. He had built an actual financial structure to sustain this. I sat in the parking lot of that grocery store for 45 minutes. People walked past with carts. A woman buckled her kids into a minivan 2 spaces over. The ordinary world went on around me, while I held a folder in my lap that told me my husband had been building a second life, with the same methodical, structural precision he applied to engineering. He had not stumbled into something. He had constructed it. I called Sandra Wiggs that night. She was a family attorney I had found 2 days after finding the receipt, just to have a number, just to be prepared. I left her a voicemail after hours, and she called me back the next morning at 8. I told her what I had. She told me I had more than most people come in with. She told me to stop accessing the financial accounts the way I had been. Too much direct access could create complications, and to let her office handle the documentation from that point forward. She told me to keep living normally. She told me not to confront him. "Can you do that?" she asked me. "Yes," I said. And I meant it. I went home. I made chicken piccata because it was Tuesday and that was our Tuesday thing, and Daniel came home at 7 and kissed me on the cheek and asked what smelled good and sat down at our table and told me about his day. I watched him talk and I thought, I know you now. I know exactly who you are. And you don't know that I know. And for right now, that is the most important advantage I have ever had. I kept that advantage for 8 months. What those 8 months looked like from the outside. A normal marriage, slightly quiet, 2 busy people in their late 30s with established routines and a shared dog and nothing obviously wrong. What they felt like from the inside, controlled, deliberate, relentless preparation. Sandra's office built the documentation file. I stopped accessing the financial accounts directly and let the paper trail speak. I made notes, dates, times, behavior observations, and sent them to Sandra's office in encrypted emails from an account Daniel didn't know existed. I went to therapy. Not couples therapy. I couldn't afford to tip him off, and honestly, I didn't want to repair anything anymore. I went alone to a woman named Dr. Akafer who had a cactus collection and a talent for the exact right question. She helped me stay functional during those months. She helped me understand that what I was feeling, that eerie, dissociated calm, was a form of protective psychological response. She helped me not lose myself in the waiting. Because the waiting was the hardest part. Not the pain. I could manage the pain by converting it, by funneling it into something useful, into preparation. The hardest part was the ordinary moments. The Sunday mornings when Daniel would make coffee and hand me a cup, and say something funny about whatever we'd watched the night before, and some reflex of habit and memory would almost make me forget. The moments when I'd catch a glimpse of the man I'd married. The way he was with Biscuit, the way he got quiet in a good way when he was reading, the laugh that still sounded like the one from that first dinner. And the grief of it would hit me so cleanly and completely that I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to breathe through it. I was grieving a person who was still alive and living in my house. There is no precise language for what that feels like. It is its own specific category of loss. I was 4 months into knowing when Patricia had her stroke. She was 71. She'd had some cardiac issues the previous year that had been managed with medication, and the stroke, when it came without warning on a Thursday morning while she was making breakfast. Her neighbor found her and called an ambulance. By the time Daniel reached the hospital, I wasn't with him. I was at work when he called me. She was stable, but the neurological picture was serious. There was significant involvement on the left side. Her speech was affected. Her mobility was severely limited. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital and came home to her own house on palliative care, with a rotating schedule of home health aides and Daniel filling in whenever he could. He was shaken in a way I hadn't seen since his father died. Whatever his failures as a husband, whatever he had built behind my back, Patricia was the bedrock of him in some essential way, and watching her decline seemed to strip something away from him that I couldn't quite name. I played my role. I brought casseroles to her house, the kind of thing you do, the kind of thing that gets noticed and appreciated by neighbors and the church community and the home health aides. I sat with her on the afternoons when Daniel couldn't be there. I talked to her even when the speech issues made her responses limited, because she was still there, still listening, still watching me with those sharp eyes that had never quite warmed. I want to tell you something I've not always included when I've talked about this. One afternoon, about 2 weeks before she died, I was sitting with Patricia in her living room. The aide had stepped out. Patricia was having a better day, her speech was clearer, and she'd been looking at some photos. She looked at me for a long moment, and I looked back at her, and she opened her mouth and said something. It was effortful, the stroke had made speech slow and labored, but she pushed it out clearly enough that I heard it. She said, "I should have told you." And then the aide came back in, and Patricia turned away, and we never spoke of it again. She never said another word to me, beyond polite necessities after that. And 3 weeks later she was gone. I have thought about those 4 words more times than I can count. I should have told you. It is the closest thing to an apology I ever received from anyone in that family, and it came from a woman who could barely form a sentence, 3 weeks before she died, in a quiet room on an afternoon when no one else was listening. Whatever Patricia's feelings about me, in the end she knew. She had always known. And she had chosen Daniel's secret over my right to the truth. That is a thing I have had to find a way to live with, not forgive, exactly, but integrate. Put it in a part of myself and leave it there. She was a complicated person. Most people are. Patricia died on a Sunday morning in November. Peacefully, her doctor said, whatever that means exactly, when you've watched someone decline over weeks the way she had. Daniel was at her bedside. I was in the hallway because there wasn't room, and because there are certain moments that belong to certain people, and that moment belonged to him. She died at 6:47 in the morning, with early winter light coming through the bedroom curtains, and Daniel came into the hallway with a face I can only describe as hollowed out. I held his hand in the hospital hallway, and I meant it. Whatever he had done, this was a real loss. People can contain real loss and real betrayal simultaneously. I held his hand because it was a human moment, and he was suffering, and I was still, technically, his wife. There was nothing false in that. The rest of everything was false. That moment was not. The funeral was 3 days after Patricia died, on a Wednesday, at First Presbyterian, a large, stately church in the neighborhood where Patricia had lived for 30 years, where she had served on 3 committees and been part of the choir until the cardiac issues made it difficult. The service was full. Easily 200 people. Patricia had been a presence in her community, and the church reflected that. Every pew occupied, flowers from a dozen different organizations, a program with 3 separate eulogies. I sat in the front row beside Daniel. I wore a black dress I'd bought specifically for this day, simple, well-cut, nothing that drew attention. I held Daniel's hand during the opening hymn. I kept my posture correct, and my expression composed throughout all 3 eulogies, and the scripture readings, and the choir's rendition of How Great Thou Art that Patricia had apparently requested herself. I was performing grief. Not entirely. There was genuine sadness in me for Patricia's passing, for the complexity of who she was, for the things she'd never said. But the overriding emotional state was not grief. It was focused attention. A tightly wound readiness. Because I had not spent 8 months preparing for nothing, and I had known, with some part of myself I couldn't have explained, that the funeral would be significant. The reception after the graveside service was in the church hall. Round tables with white cloths and low floral centerpieces. Coffee and tea in polished urns. Catered trays of the small triangle sandwiches that appear at every solemn church gathering, as if there's a law requiring them. Daniel was immediately absorbed into a cluster of his mother's friends and longtime neighbors who wanted to express condolences in person, and I drifted toward the coffee urns because I needed something to do with my hands. I was reaching for a cup when I heard a laugh. It was a specific laugh, light, slightly musical, the kind that carries across a room without being loud. And I had never heard that laugh before in my life, and yet something in me went absolutely still when I heard it. The way animals go still. The instinct ahead of the knowledge. I turned around. She was standing near the far door of the hall, partially turned away from me, talking with Daniel's cousin Marcus. She was wearing a simple black dress, holding a small clutch purse, and she looked like any other guest, tasteful, composed, appropriate to the occasion. She was younger than me. Dark hair cut to her shoulders. The kind of effortless composure that comes from being comfortable in a situation most people would find unbearably uncomfortable. She was Melissa Cho. I knew it before I consciously processed how I knew it. Robert's file had contained photographs. I had looked at those photographs enough times that her face had become as familiar to me as anyone I'd known for years. And here she was, at Patricia's funeral in the church hall, talking to Daniel's family, as if she had every right to be there. She felt my gaze. People do when it's that direct. She turned her head, and our eyes met across the hall, across the white-clothed tables, across the grieving neighbors, across the triangle sandwiches and the polished coffee urns. And instead of looking away, instead of showing any flicker of alarm or shame or even surprise, she looked at me steadily for a moment. And then she smiled at me. It was not a cruel smile. That's the part that stays with me. It was almost gentle, a slow, knowing, faintly sympathetic smile, like she was looking at someone whose situation she already fully understood. Like she felt sorry for me. Like she had already mapped out the geometry of this situation and found her place in it, and found mine, and was looking at me from across that distance with something that was almost pity. It was that smile, not the texts, not the receipts, not the photographs, that broke something open in me. Because that smile told me everything that Robert's file couldn't, that Melissa Cho had not been kept secret from the family. She had been woven in. She was known. She had been in that world, in Patricia's world, with Daniel, in a way that I had never been. And all those years of Patricia's coolness, her civil distance, her smiles that never reached her eyes, suddenly they reordered themselves in my mind into something that made a completely different kind of sense. She had known who this woman was. She had accepted her. She had kept Daniel's secret because it served the vision she'd always had for her son's life. And I, solid, steady, show-up Claire, had simply been the inconvenient official version that was eventually going to be corrected. I set my coffee cup down very carefully on the table beside me. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. All those months of preparation, and in the moment itself, I was very still. Very clear. The kind of clarity I imagine surgeons and pilots describe, not the absence of emotion, but its perfect subordination to what needs to happen. I walked across the church hall. I want you to picture this. Me, in my black dress, walking at a measured pace past the tables and the guests and the floral centerpieces, directly toward Melissa Cho. Marcus was still talking. She saw me coming and her expression shifted. The gentle smile faded, replaced by something more guarded, less certain. She had expected the woman she'd imagined me to be. She was about to meet the woman I actually was. I stopped in front of her. I did not raise my voice. I did not perform anything. I spoke in a tone so level and contained that Marcus, standing 18 inches away, would have struggled to hear it. I said, I know exactly who you are. I have known for 8 months. I have the hotel receipts, the credit card statements, the investigator's report, and the photographs. My attorney has had all of it since March. I need you to leave this reception now. She stared at me. The sympathy was completely gone. She looked suddenly very young, like someone whose script had just been taken from them mid-scene. She looked at me with something that might have been fear or the beginning of it, and then she gathered her composure. I'll give her that, she gathered it quickly. And she picked up her clutch and turned and walked toward the exit. She did not say a word. The door opened and closed behind her. Marcus was looking at me with a completely blank expression. I turned and walked back toward the center of the room. Daniel had seen it happen from across the hall. He'd been watching the whole approach, the brief exchange, her exit. By the time I reached him, the color had drained from his face entirely. Not pale, properly pale, the gray-white of someone whose adrenaline has hit and has nowhere to go. His mouth was slightly open. He looked, in that moment, very small. I stopped in front of him. The cluster of condolence givers had shuffled politely aside. I looked at my husband, this man I had loved, this man I had trusted with everything, this man who had used that trust as a surface to build a second life on, and I said, quietly enough that only he could hear me, "This is not the day for this conversation. Today is about your mother, and you deserve to grieve her. But tomorrow morning, the lawyers talk. I want you to go home tonight and think carefully about how you want to handle what comes next, because I promise you, I am prepared for every version of it." He opened his mouth. His throat moved. Nothing came out. I held his gaze for a moment. And then I turned, walked back to the coffee table, poured myself a fresh cup, walked to the far side of the room, and sat down beside his Aunt Beverly, who was 82 and wore a hearing aid that wasn't quite calibrated right, and proceeded to tell me about a pecan pie recipe from a 1987 church cookbook that she'd been perfecting for 35 years and was quite sure was the best in Cabarrus County. I sat with Aunt Beverly for 45 minutes. I listened to every word about that pecan pie. I held myself together with the same steadiness that had gotten me through 8 months of sleeping beside a stranger. And then I said my goodbyes, warmly, appropriately, the way you do at a funeral. And I walked out to my car and I drove home and I parked in the driveway and I walked straight to the kitchen table and I sat down and I cried. Not for Daniel. Not for Melissa Cho. Not even really for myself. I cried for the marriage I had believed in. For the Tuesday chicken picadas. For the proposal on the kitchen floor, with the dog getting in the middle of everything. For the woman who had stood at that altar looking at the man she was certain was exactly right, and had been so spectacularly, so devastatingly, so completely wrong. I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I washed my face. And then I made tea and sat at the table in the quiet and felt, underneath the grief, something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like myself. I want to stop here for just a second. Because I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, how did she hold it together? How do you sit next to someone for 8 months, knowing what you know and not break? I'm going to answer that in just a minute. But first, if you are finding value in this story, if any part of what I'm saying is landing for you, please hit the like button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it means this story reaches more people who might need to hear it. And subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you about what happened during the divorce process and what happened after is the part most people don't talk about. Don't miss it. I'll be right back in the story. Daniel came home that night around 10. I was in bed, not asleep. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a moment and then went to the guest room without a word. That was the last night we slept in the same house. By the end of that week, he had moved some things to an extended stay hotel, and the house was mine in a way that felt both liberating and deeply, thoroughly strange. Sandra filed the initial paperwork within 48 hours of the funeral. Daniel hired a family law attorney named Mark Chen, a well-regarded local guy with a reputation for being thorough and strategic. We were in for a process. I knew that. I had prepared for it. What I had not fully prepared for was the psychological weight of it. The divorce process is a sustained exercise in deconstructing a shared life piece by piece. The house, the finances, the accounts, the property, the shared history of things that don't have monetary value but carry enormous weight. It is also, if contested, an exercise in watching the person you loved find reasons to minimize you. Daniel's legal team pushed back on the settlement figures. They questioned the documentation. They suggested that the private investigator's report contained procedural issues. It didn't. Sandra had had it vetted thoroughly. There was one mediation session that was particularly brutal. Daniel was across the table from me, the first time I'd sat in the same room with him since the funeral, and he looked at me at one point with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. Not anger. Not remorse. Something more like exhaustion, and maybe the faintest edge of something that wanted to be pleading, but couldn't quite get there. I looked back at him and felt nothing that resembled love. What I felt was something more architectural. The calm, structural certainty of someone who has done the work and has nothing left to prove. The settlement was finalized in the spring. I kept the house. I kept Biscuit. I received a settlement amount that Sandra had targeted and achieved. Daniel retained more of the liquid assets than I would have preferred, but the house was in a neighborhood that had appreciated substantially, and the long-term math was in my favor. More than the money, and this is what I want you to hear, I kept myself. I walked out of that process with my documentation, my dignity, and a clear-eyed sense of my own competence. Daniel had built a shell LLC to sustain a secret life. I had built a legal case that left him with very few options. On balance, I felt that I had managed the situation rather well. The thing I was not prepared for, the thing no one really talks about when they tell divorce stories, was the social wreckage. Daniel and I had a shared social world. Most couples do after 11 years. Neighbors. Couples we'd been close with. His friends who had become our friends. When the separation became known, that world divided, mostly along the lines I might have predicted but hoped wouldn't happen. Some people chose sides immediately and chose his, which stung in ways I hadn't anticipated, particularly with people I genuinely believed liked me. Some people simply went quiet, which in some ways was worse. The phone gets quieter. The invitations stop coming. You realize how much of your social life was load-bearing infrastructure that the marriage had been providing without your fully noticing. His cousin Marcus stopped texting. A couple we'd socialized with for years, quarterly dinners, the whole ritual, simply ceased contact without a word. I later heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that both of them had known about Melissa for over a year. Had known and had sat at my table and eaten my food and laughed at my jokes and gone home and kept the secret. That particular discovery, that the betrayal was not just Daniel's, but had been socially maintained by a whole network of people who valued his comfort over my right to the truth, was in some ways harder to metabolize than the original betrayal itself. I leaned on the people who remained. My sister Rachel, who showed up at my door 3 days after the separation with 2 bottles of wine and a lasagna, and proceeded to stay the weekend. My college friend Diane, who called me every Sunday morning for 8 months without exception. Dr. Akefer, who continued to be exactly the right person in a small office full of cacti. These 3 women were the architecture of my recovery in those early months, and I am not someone who uses the word grateful lightly, but I am deeply, precisely grateful for each of them. I also, in those months, became intensely familiar with myself in a way I hadn't been in years. When you share a life with someone, you absorb their preferences alongside your own until you can't always tell the difference. Suddenly, I had evenings that were entirely mine. No schedule to coordinate, no television compromise, no social obligations inherited from his professional world. I cooked things Daniel had found too complicated or too spicy or too unfamiliar. I read until 2 in the morning when I felt like it. I went to a pottery class that I'd thought about for 3 years and never signed up for because the schedule didn't work for both of us. The first time I made dinner for just myself, a proper dinner, not just whatever was easy, and ate it at the kitchen table with biscuit at my feet and a podcast playing on the counter, I felt something that surprised me. It wasn't loneliness. It was something closer to relief. The quiet was mine. The table was mine. The evening was entirely, uncomplicatedly mine. That surprised me more than almost anything else in this whole story. Recovery is not a line. I want to say that very clearly because stories get told as if they have clean arcs. The fall, the crisis, the rebuild, the triumphant ending. Real life is not structured that way. Real life is more like a topographic map. There are clear gains and clear setbacks and stretches of flat, ambiguous terrain where you're not sure if you're moving forward or simply covering ground. There were bad nights in that first year. Nights when I'd wake up at 3 a.m, with the specific, chest-compressing ache of someone who has lost not just a person, but a version of their own life. Nights when the silence of the house felt heavy rather than mine. Nights when I'd scroll back through old photographs. We had 11 years of them, and feel the specific cruelty of a past that had been real and the future that would now never happen simultaneously. I allowed those nights. I didn't try to manage them or reframe them or convert them into something productive. I let them be what they were. Dr. Okafor had been very clear about this. Grief needs space to be grief. You can't accelerate through it by being stoic or strategic. You have to let it move through you at its own speed. So I did. On those bad nights, I cried if I needed to, and I sat with Biscuit and I let the thing be the thing it was. And then, gradually, the bad nights became less frequent. Not less real when they came. The grief didn't get shallower, exactly, it just came less often. And the days between became increasingly, genuinely okay. Not performed okay. Actually okay. Around the 8-month mark after the separation, I started to feel like myself in a way that was different from before. The old Claire had been steady and reliable, yes, but she'd also been someone who silenced her instincts for the sake of keeping a peace that was never really hers to keep. The new version of me was quieter in some ways, less eager to fill space, less driven by the need to be the person everyone could count on, but louder in others. I said no more readily. I asked for what I needed. I stopped attending things I didn't want to attend. I stopped maintaining relationships that asked more of me than they gave back. I became, in the way that serious loss sometimes produces this, considerably more selective and considerably more honest about how I spent my time and with whom. I repainted the house. I want to mention this specifically because it was more significant than it sounds. We'd had the interior painted when we bought it, a palette that Daniel had largely chosen, cool grays and off-whites that were tasteful and completely impersonal. I hired a painter and we went room by room. I chose colors I'd always been drawn to. A warm terracotta for the kitchen, a deep sage for the bedroom, a rich cream for the living room that caught the afternoon light differently than the gray ever had. When it was done, I stood in the kitchen on a Saturday afternoon and looked around at the color I'd chosen, in the house that was mine, and felt something settle in me permanently. That was when I knew the hardest part was over. I went back to the gym. I started cooking Italian food, which is time-consuming and fussy, and something Daniel had always found excessive for a weeknight. I adopted a second dog, a 3-legged beagle mix from the shelter named Murray, who Biscuit regarded with initial suspicion and eventual resigned affection. I got promoted to the director-level role I'd been working toward, the one that had been on my professional horizon for years, the one I'd sometimes wondered if I'd been giving enough of myself to, because I was spending so much energy maintaining the equilibrium of a marriage that wasn't what I thought it was. Freed of that weight, my professional attention sharpened considerably. People always want to know what happened to Daniel and Melissa. I understand the impulse. Stories need consequence, and the people who behave badly in them should, in a just world, pay something for it. Here is what I know. Daniel and Melissa stayed together for about 8 months after the divorce was finalized. By best estimate from the few remaining mutual contacts who still occasionally mentioned him in my peripheral social world. They did not get married. They ended it, I don't know why, and I didn't pursue the why. By the time I heard about it, it landed in me with the weight of news from a place I used to live. Mildly interesting, essentially irrelevant. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard it. I want to be honest about that because I think there is a version of this story where I'm supposed to feel vindicated. He lost the good thing, he lost me, and then he lost the other thing too, and justice has been served. But the truth is that by that point, Daniel's life had become so genuinely unrelated to mine that his romantic outcomes registered to me the way weather in another city registers. I noted it, and then I went on with my day. What I feel about him now, and I've had a few years to arrive at something stable and clear, is mostly nothing. Not hatred, not love, not residual bitterness. There are moments when I'll see something that connects to a specific memory, a particular song, a particular restaurant, the smell of a specific cologne, and I'll feel a brief, precise wave of something that is half grief and half nostalgia, and then it passes. He is part of my past in the way that formative things become part of your past, present in your shape, but no longer active in your life. I saw him once, about a year ago, at a mutual friend's retirement party. He was there with someone new, a woman I'd never seen, older, quieter than Melissa, who stayed close to his side all evening. He looked older, a little softer, a little less certain of himself than I'd remembered. We made eye contact once, across the room, and both nodded. The specific nod of two people who share a complicated history and have arrived separately at a place of sufficient distance that no words are required. We did not speak. There was nothing left to say. I drove home from that party with the windows down because it was October, and the air was that specific sharp, sweet early fall temperature that I have always loved. Both dogs were home waiting for me. I had a plant on my kitchen windowsill that I'd managed to keep alive for 8 months, which was a personal record. I had a book I was halfway through that I was genuinely looking forward to getting back to. I had an early morning meeting the next day that I was actually prepared for. I sat in my driveway for a minute before going in. Just sat there in the quiet with the engine cooling. I thought about the church hall, about the moment of looking across the room and having everything rearrange itself into truth. I had been so afraid of that moment for so long. And when it came, it was almost quiet. Almost a relief. You know what came after the relief? My life. The one that was actually mine. I'm 41 now. I live in a house with terracotta walls in the kitchen, and 2 dogs and a thriving career, and a small, carefully chosen circle of people who I trust completely, because I have learned, at some cost, to choose carefully. I have been asked, many times, if I would do anything differently. People want me to say I would have left sooner. They want me to say I would have confronted him the moment I found the receipt. Maybe they're right. Maybe leaving sooner would have been the braver choice, the more self-respecting choice, the choice that costs less in accumulated pain. But here is what I actually think, when I think honestly about it. I did what I could do with what I knew at the speed at which I was capable of doing it. The 8 months of preparation were not weakness. They were not avoidance. They were the work of a woman who was going to leave, and was going to leave on terms that protected her. I came out of my marriage with my house, with a settlement, with documentation that left no room for dispute, and with something more important than any of that, with my full understanding of what had happened and why. I did not leave confused. I left clear. Clarity costs something to acquire. I paid for mine. I think the price was fair. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll let you go. It's the thing I've said to every person who has come to me in a quiet moment with that look in their eyes, the look of someone who has a cold stone in their chest that they've been pretending not to feel. Knowing is always better than not knowing. The truth does not get softer if you wait. The lie does not become less of a lie if you choose not to look at the evidence. Every day you spend living inside a version of reality that someone else constructed for you is a day that belongs to them and not to you. You pay for the not knowing in your instincts, in your self-trust, in your clarity about your own perception of the world. And those are the most fundamental things you have. You cannot afford to let someone else erode them. Look, even when it's terrifying, even when you're afraid of what you'll find. Look and then decide what you're going to do with what you find, and take the time you need to do it well. But look, it will cost you something. I promise you, it will be less than the alternative. I got myself back. Imperfectly, incompletely, not in a straight line, but I got there. And I am sitting at my terracotta-walled kitchen table right now, with Murray asleep across my feet and Biscuit somewhere in the yard. And I feel like a person who is fully, finally, occupying her own life. That is the ending I want for you too. Whatever the truth is that you're carrying, whatever the thing is that you're not looking at directly yet, I want you to know that there is a version of you on the other side of knowing it. Steadier, clearer, more wholly yourself than you have been in years. She's waiting. Go find her. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. Genuinely. You just sat with me through something I've carried for a long time, and the fact that you stayed means something to me. I want to hear from you in the comments. Not just great story, tell me something real. Tell me if any part of Claire's story sounds like your life right now. Tell me if you've been through something like this and come out the other side. Tell me what helped you. These comments, your words, are the reason I keep sharing these stories, and I read every single one. If this hit you somewhere real, share this video with someone who needs it. You don't have to explain why. Just send it. The right person will understand. And if you're new here and you want more stories like this one, real, honest, unfiltered stories about the hardest parts of family and love and starting over, subscribe right now. Every week. I'll be here. I'll see you in the next one.